Silence is a strange thing. We tend to interpret it as emptiness, as absence, as a lack of care, but it's not. Silence is rarely empty. It's often full of tension, of questions, of emotions too complicated to articulate. When she's silent, when she's not texting, not calling, not showing up the way she used to, your mind automatically jumps to conclusions. She's moved on, she's forgotten you, she doesn't care anymore. But that's the surface interpretation, and it's almost always wrong. People process things in their own way, and for many women, silence is not a sign of detachment, it's a form of protection. It's an armor. Not because they want to forget, but because remembering hurts too much. She may be quiet, yes, but not because she's let go. She's quiet because holding on in silence is easier than trying to explain the chaos in her heart. When a woman says nothing, that stillness might actually be the sound of everything she's feeling all at once. This is where most people misunderstand emotional withdrawal. It's not always avoidance. It's often an attempt to regain control. You might think she's indifferent, that she's shut the door and thrown away the key, but more often than not, she's sitting on the other side of that door, back against it, hands over her mouth, just trying not to break. Her silence could be the only thing keeping her from reaching out too soon, from making herself too vulnerable, from reopening wounds that haven't even started to heal. And this silence, it's not the end. It's a space where she thinks, feels, and replays every moment. The late night conversations, the subtle glances, the laughter, the conflict, the regret. She remembers it all, whether she wants to or not. And that remembering is painful because it's tied to a hope she doesn't know what to do with. She can't call, she won't reach out because she's unsure of what she'd find if she did. Would you answer? Would you care? Or worse, have you already stopped thinking about her altogether? That's the cruel irony of silence. Both of you could be thinking about each other, longing for each other, but neither one makes a move because she's afraid that her vulnerability will be met with your indifference, afraid that reaching out will expose her to rejection one more time, so she chooses the safer pain, the pain of wondering, of hoping, of missing you in private over the sharp sting of a possible dismissal. This is why you must never confuse her silence for forgetting. The truth is, we don't forget people we've loved. We just find new ways to carry the weight of them. Sometimes that looks like smiling through a memory. Other times it looks like closing off completely. But inside, that person still lives in us, quietly influencing our thoughts, our choices, our emotions. And so when she goes silent, don't assume she's erased you. Know that you may still echo in her mind, perhaps every day, perhaps every night. Her silence might not be the absence of love, but the overflow of it, the kind of love that can't find safe passage through words anymore. Because silence, real heavy silence, isn't what happens when someone stops caring. It's what happens when they care so much they don't know how to begin saying it out loud again. There's something that happens when you disappear. When you stop responding, stop engaging, when you go ghost. At first, people might think it's temporary. Maybe you're just busy. Maybe you're going through something. They wait, they watch. But when the silence lingers, when your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was, something shifts. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds. It creeps into their thoughts in small, subtle waves. They begin to realize just how much space you actually occupied in their life. How your presence wasn't background noise, it was the melody. And when that melody stops playing, they notice. You see, presence is one of those things we often take for granted, especially when someone is consistent, when they're always there, always showing up, always reliable. People get used to that. They start to assume it. And then one day, when that presence is no longer there, when the messages stop, the support disappears, and the attention vanishes, reality crashes in. The absence becomes a mirror. It forces people to reflect on what they never truly appreciated while they had it. That's the hidden power of going ghost. It disrupts patterns. It breaks the rhythm others have grown comfortable with, and it makes them question their own role in your disappearance. Was it something they said, something they did, or worse, something they didn't do? That introspection is unavoidable. Your silence becomes the pressure that exposes cracks in their behavior, in their assumptions, in the way they treated you. You don't have to say a word, the silence speaks for you. And in that silence, you become unforgettable. Not because you tried to prove your worth, not because you pleaded to be seen, but because you stopped showing up. And that act alone forced others to recognize what your presence truly meant. When someone becomes accustomed to your energy, your empathy, your loyalty, and you suddenly pull that energy back, the void is undeniable. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's clean, quiet, absolute, and that's exactly why it's so powerful. People remember how you made them feel, yes, but they remember even more how it felt when you stopped making them feel anything at all. That absence burns itself into memory, and the longer it lasts, the more vivid the image becomes of what was lost. It's ironic, isn't it? You become more present in their mind by being completely absent from their life. But there's another side to this too, one that often gets overlooked. Going ghost isn't just about creating absence for others. It's about reclaiming presence for yourself. It's about stepping away so you can breathe, think, and feel without being trapped in cycles of over-explaining, over-giving, or over-proving your worth to people who were never listening in the first place. It's not an act of revenge, it's an act of self-restoration. In the quiet, you recalibrate, you remember your value, you stop performing for people who watched you bleed and asked why you were making a mess. You learn to hold your energy sacred again, and in doing so, your silence becomes a boundary. Not a punishment, but a declaration. A quiet, powerful statement. I matter too. Because when you go ghost, not out of spite, but out of necessity, you don't just disappear from others. You reappear to yourself. And sometimes, that's the most unforgettable move you can make. When you go ghost, something unexpected begins to happen, not just for the people you walked away from, but for you as well. There's a clarity that starts to set in. A silence that doesn't feel empty but sharp. It strips away the noise, the distractions, the manipulations, everything that used to cloud your mind. Suddenly you begin to see things for what they are, not for what you were told they were. And that kind of clarity is dangerous because once you truly see, you can't unsee. Think about how much energy you used to spend trying to interpret people's mixed signals. How much time you wasted trying to fix what you didn't break. When you go ghost, you're no longer participating in that emotional tug of war. You remove yourself from the manipulation, the chaos, and the guilt traps. And in that stillness, you begin to realize how deeply you were being drained, how much of yourself you gave away just to keep the peace, to avoid being misunderstood, or to stay connected to people who couldn't even meet you halfway. That space you create isn't just for others to reflect, it's for you to recover. You start hearing your own voice again. You recognize how much of your worth you handed over to people who didn't deserve it. And you begin to feel the difference between attention and respect, between attraction and consistency, between being seen and being valued. That's what clarity brings. It separates the real from the fake, the loyal from the opportunistic, the temporary from the permanent. And here's the thing, once you've experienced that kind of clarity, you don't chase the same things anymore. You don't beg for half-hearted love or tolerate one-sided effort. You stop romanticizing dysfunction just because it feels familiar. You become more selective with who gets access to you, not out of bitterness, but because you've finally realized that your time, your energy, your presence, it's not cheap, it's sacred. When you're caught in constant communication, always explaining, always justifying, always trying to make someone see your perspective, it's easy to lose yourself. Going ghost removes that pressure. You don't have to convince anyone anymore. You don't need to argue your value. You're no longer dancing for the crumbs of validation. You step back and you let your absence do the talking. That's when you start seeing people's true character. Not when you're giving, but when you stop. Some will blame you. Some will play victim, some will pretend they didn't notice, and some will finally realize just how much you held everything together. But you won't be watching for their reactions anymore, because clarity isn't about their awakening, It's about yours. And there's nothing loud or performative about this. No announcements, no explanations. Just you quietly pulling back, slowly reconnecting with your own sense of peace. And from that place, you begin to build boundaries that are not made of fear or anger, but of deep self-respect. You start living with intention. You surround yourself with people who don't make you feel like you're hard to love. And most importantly, you refuse to shrink yourself to fit back into spaces that couldn't hold your growth. Going ghost isn't about disappearing from the world, it's about disappearing from dysfunction. So when that clarity comes, don't run from it, embrace it. Because once you see the truth, there's no going back. And that's the beginning of real freedom. The moment you go ghost, people start to feel your absence in ways they never acknowledged your presence. That's the irony. You could give your energy, your attention, your loyalty, and it would be taken for granted. But the second you stop showing up, the second your energy is no longer available, that absence becomes louder than any words you could have spoken. It forces people to confront a void they didn't think mattered until it does. There's a psychological shift that happens when you remove yourself. People don't always notice the weight you carry until you set it down. They don't feel the warmth you brought until it's gone. They don't recognize the peace you provided until they're surrounded by chaos without you. And that's not manipulation, it's reality, because presence is easy to overlook, but absence is impossible to ignore. Going ghost doesn't mean you're trying to punish anyone. It simply means you're no longer willing to pour into places that left you empty. You're no longer entertaining connections that cost you more than they contribute. And once you stop feeding those dynamics, people are left with themselves, and they often don't like what they find because you were the distraction from their own dysfunction. You were the one who smoothed things over, made excuses, kept things afloat. Without you, they're forced to deal with the truth they've been avoiding. And here's what happens next. Some people will scramble to regain access, not because they respect you, but because they miss what you did for them. They'll mask it as care, as apology, as realization, but look closer. Are they drawn to you or to the benefits of having you around? Are they returning because they see your value now or because your silence exposed how much they relied on your presence to feel whole? That distinction is everything. Because when you've been used to people who only show up when they need something, going ghost becomes a filter. It shows you who's real. It reveals who's capable of loving you without constant reminders, without your energy being the fuel for their validation. And once you've seen the truth of that, it changes how you relate to everyone. You don't chase, you don't explain, you don't negotiate with inconsistency. You simply remain unavailable to anything that costs you your peace. In fact, silence becomes your new boundary. You no longer argue to be understood. You no longer beg to be treated with basic respect. You no longer perform emotional labor for people who can't even meet you with honesty. Your absence becomes the message, and it's one that can't be twisted or ignored. And over time, the people who truly valued you, who appreciated your presence before the silence, will prove it. Not through grand gestures, but through consistency, accountability, and respect. The rest will fade away, some with resentment, some with confusion, but all with the consequence of taking you lightly. This is the power of going ghost. It shows you what's real by removing the noise. It's not about creating drama, it's about creating distance so the truth can reveal itself. And once it does, you move forward with a clarity that doesn't need validation. You become someone who no longer needs to announce their worth because it's felt in your absence, in your peace, and in the strength it took to walk away. When you go ghost, you begin to learn the art of emotional detachment, and that's where real power lies. You stop reacting to things that used to shake you. You stop explaining yourself to people who never actually listened. You stop looking for closure in places where all you ever found was chaos. That silence you give becomes more than absence. It becomes a declaration of emotional self-control. And in a world that thrives on noise, attention, validation, and confrontation, choosing silence is a radical act of power. Most people are emotionally entangled, constantly pulled into drama, confusion, or manipulation. They're triggered by every little thing. They feel compelled to respond, to defend themselves, to chase after clarity. But once you've tasted peace, you no longer give your energy away so easily. You stop giving people the satisfaction of knowing they still have that kind of access to you. You realize you don't need to fight for understanding because your worth isn't up for debate. Going ghost teaches you something that no conversation can, that emotional detachment doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you choose what deserves a reaction. It means you no longer allow yourself to be puppeteered by someone else's chaos. You gain the strength to sit with discomfort without immediately seeking resolution. You learn to walk away without needing to prove anything. That's emotional maturity. That's strength. Not everyone is ready for that, and that's okay. Because here's what happens. People who once thrived on your reactions will be stunned by your silence. They'll try to provoke a response, bait you back into the dysfunction, guilt you into returning to the role they've written for you. But when you don't react, when you remain grounded in your peace, it dismantles their illusion of control. They realize you've emotionally outgrown the games they're still playing. And there's freedom in that when you no longer need someone to acknowledge your pain for it to be valid, when you no longer depend on someone else's apology to begin healing, when you no longer search for closure from the very source of your wounds. That's liberation. You become emotionally self-sufficient. You begin to find your answers within. You start to value solitude over superficial connection, and you stop placing your emotional well-being in the hands of people who never protected it in the first place. It's a shift that changes everything. You're no longer ruled by the need to be seen or understood by those who were never willing to meet you halfway. You don't explain your silence. You don't justify your distance. You allow people to sit with the discomfort of not having access to you, and that discomfort often speaks louder than your presence ever could. When you go ghost, you aren't trying to win. You aren't seeking attention. You're choosing yourself. You're stepping away from the emotional roller coaster and choosing a steady ground where peace, clarity, and self-respect guide your decisions. And that scares people who relied on your emotional availability as a source of their own power. The truth is, emotional detachment isn't coldness, it's wisdom. It's knowing what to engage with and what to let pass. It's realizing that sometimes the strongest response is no response. And when you truly understand that, no one can pull you back into the chaos you left behind. You become untouchable. Not because you don't care, but because you finally care enough to protect your energy above all else. And eventually, when you go ghost, people begin to realize the depth of your absence. And that's when the silence becomes deafening. Not for you, but for them. You see, people become so used to your presence, your energy, your availability, that they start to treat it as a given. You were always the one who listened, who stayed, who forgave. Even in moments when you were the one hurting, you still showed up. But the moment you decide not to anymore, the moment you withdraw and go silent, it sends a shockwave through the dynamic because silence speaks. It echoes. It forces people to sit with themselves, often for the first time. When you remove your presence, they're left with nothing to bounce off of, no one to project their issues onto, no one to keep the cycle going. They can't manipulate your emotions if you're no longer offering your attention. They can't rewrite the narrative when you're not there to argue your side, and that's terrifying to people who relied on your responses to fuel their behavior. And that's what makes going ghost so powerful. It doesn't just remove you physically, it removes you energetically. The conversation is over, not because you stormed out, not because you screamed and slammed a door, but because you simply stopped participating. There's no closure, no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet decision to reclaim your space and protect your peace. And that decision, though quiet, is deeply disruptive to those who counted on your emotional involvement. What happens next is revealing. Some will lash out, some will act like you've wronged them, some will pretend not to notice. But none of it changes the fact that your absence has weight. Because it's not just your silence they feel, it's everything that used to come with you. Your warmth, your forgiveness, your emotional labor, your consistency. When all of that is suddenly gone, they're forced to confront what they never valued when they had it. And that's the paradox. They don't realize how much you mattered until you're no longer there to matter. People often need the silence to appreciate the noise they once dismissed. Your absence becomes a mirror. It reflects their patterns, their choices, their failure to meet you where you were. And not everyone is ready to face that reflection. Some will run from it. Others will try to replace you. But the ones who truly feel it, the ones who genuinely experience the shift, won't forget it. You didn't go ghost to prove a point. You went ghost because staying was costing you more than it was giving. You went ghost because your peace was being taxed by chaos. You went ghost because you finally realized that not everyone deserves access to you. And while they may not say it, while they may pretend like your absence means nothing, deep down they know, they feel it. Because when someone who was once so present, so giving, so emotionally invested suddenly vanishes, it leaves a void that's impossible to ignore. You may not see the ripple effect right away, but it's there. You've disrupted the dynamic in the most powerful way possible, not by reacting, not by explaining, not by proving anything, but by simply removing yourself. That's when you know you've grown. When you no longer need to be heard to know your value. When your silence carries more weight than any words could.